Hey guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to another video tutorial where we are building this CMS application using ASP.NET Core 3 and Angular 10. In the last video tutorial, we implemented forgot password functionality where the user can use the forgot password option on the login page to reset their password in case they have forgotten their password. They would have to provide their email and they will receive an email on their registered email address with the reset password link. If you haven't watched that video tutorial, I recommend you to go ahead and watch it before you start working on this new feature that we are going to implement. The new feature that we are going to implement is two-factor authentication, and let's look at the demo of how this feature works. For the current user that I'm trying to log in, the two-factor authentication is on, so the user would have to provide a two-factor code in order to log in and view their account details. So let's go ahead and see the demo. So here the user will provide their username and password. Once they provide their username and password and click login, they will see a page like this, which is the send code component, where they will have a session expiry time, and they will also have an option to choose the provider. Now the provider is email or phone, so we can send the user their two-factor code via email or phone. In this phase of the video tutorial, we are not implementing SMS service. Therefore, we will be using email as our default provider to send two-factor codes to the user. So in this particular scenario, I'm going to select email as I know I have not implemented SMS service. So here you can see the session will expire in the remaining seconds for the session expiry. So go ahead and I will click send. Once I click send, I should receive an email in my inbox with the two-factor code. Here is the two-factor code that I will copy and paste on this new component view that I'm redirected to, which says validate authentication code. Here I have to provide the two-factor code. Let's go ahead and provide an invalid code just to see the error handling. So when I click send, I will see a toast message that pops up saying invalid code was entered. So we will go ahead and specify the correct two-digit or two-factor code and click send. And once we provide the correct two-factor code, we should be able to log in and access the profile details. So this was the demo of what we are going to implement. So let's go ahead and implement this two-factor authentication feature in our project. So to implement two-factor authentication, we have to do certain changes to the database. We have to add a new table where we can store these two-factor codes and other information related to the two-factor code like the user ID, device ID, and so on. So we would have to create a new model class in the model service. In the model service, go ahead and create this class called as TwoFactorCodeModel. Here you will add the following properties that you would need to create the table columns. Keep in mind that this code is available in our DevOps repo, and the link for that DevOps repo is available in the video description. If you are interested in the source code, you can find the source code in our DevOps repo. Once you have created a class in your model service called as TwoFactorCodeModel, you can go ahead and create additional two classes also at the same time that we would need in this two-factor authentication process. One of the class would be TwoFactorRequestModel, which will be having three properties, which is the provider type, the two-factor token, and the remember device. The provider type is basically email, SMS, so it depends on what provider type we have in our application or what the user has selected. We can store that value in this property. Two-factor token is a temporary token that we use when the first authentication step is completed. Since the second authentication step is not yet completed, we cannot issue a valid JWT token to the user. Therefore, we issue a temporary token, and that temporary token will be called as two-factor token. The remember device flag is basically the checkbox which is set to true or false when the user wants to remember their device. And when we implemented JWT tokens in our application, we use this flag to specify the expiry time of the token. If this device, remember device value is set to true by the user, then we make sure that the token expires after a certain period, not the usual expiry time that we have on the app settings. Basically, we extend the expiry time. The other class that you will create is two-factor response model, which will contain the following properties, which is associated with the two-factor response. These three classes needs to be created in your model service project. After you have created these classes, you would go to your data service project. So we'll go to the data service project. Here in the application DB context, you will add the DP set for two-factor model, and you will call it as two-factor code. The naming conventions that I have followed, you don't have to follow them. You can use your own naming convention, but make sure where you have changed the names, you use the same names in the code as well. Or you can leave it as it is and copy the code that I have. So once you have added the DB set, the next step is to go ahead and recreate your migrations. Now recreating your migrations also means to delete your database. Since I'm in the development version, it is easy for me to go to Azure Data Studio and run these following commands or queries to drop these databases that I have created for the CMS project. But if you have already deployed the project to production, then you don't have to delete the database in production. So at the moment, we are just adding one additional table to the CMS Core ng dev database. So I will show you how you can create a script for that and how you can update it in production. But before that, in the development mode, first we will go ahead and delete these two databases by running these commands. So I'm going to run these commands. So keep in mind that these commands, once executed, the databases will get deleted. So if you go and then refresh your local host, you should not see any databases because we have deleted it by running the queries. Now we will go to the project. We have added the DB set. We will go ahead and create the migrations. So the existing migrations folder, we will go ahead and delete it. Now we will go ahead and build our project to make sure that we don't have any errors. So the project was built successfully without any errors. Now let's go ahead and run the migrations command. We will right click on our project, go to tools and open the project in terminal. Once we have the project opened in terminal, we will run the following command. We will run the command .NET EF migrations add initial create. Here initial create is the name given to this migration. You can change this name as per your requirement. We have used the context flag to specify the context name. Since we have multiple contexts in our application, the context name is basically the name of the class that we use in the data service. So we have application DB context and we have data protection keys context for the encryption of data in our application. So in the terminal, we are going to specify the context name and run the following command. Once we hit enter, the build process should start and the migrations should be created. Once the migrations have been successfully created, you should see a migrations folder regenerated inside your CMS Core ng project or inside your project. So the migrations were successfully created, and if we go to our project, expand our project, we should have the migrations folder once again created with the initial create migrations for the application DB context. Here we will have the code that is required to create the tables. We are doing this using Entity Framework code. Now we have to generate the database for our second database context, which is the data protection keys context. So we will go ahead, let's clear the terminal and type in the following command. Here we have change the name of the context class to data protection keys context, which is the name of the context class. And here we will hit enter again. By doing this, once again the build will start and the migrations will be created for this context that we are running this migrations command. So the migrations was created and we have a folder for our second migration, and we have the initial create file created with the migrations. Now we have implemented the migrations, but we have not yet created the database. In our application, we have implemented the functionality to create database when we run the application for the first time. We have shown you how to create the database by running the application. If you have not watched the full video tutorial series, I recommend you to watch the video tutorial that was created for creating the database using Entity Framework Core. In that video tutorial, I have shown you how to create your database with Entity Framework Core and how to ensure that the database is created when the application is run. So now when I run this application, Entity Framework Core will make sure that the database gets created. So the application is loaded. We will go ahead and check the Azure Data Studio to make sure that the database is created. If you go ahead, right click on a database folder and click refresh, we should have the two databases created. This was done by the ensure database created command and functionality that we have implemented. If we go to the tables folder, we will find the tokens table and the two-factor codes table. Now the two-factor codes table is the table that we created for enabling two-factor authentication in our project. Since it was the development mode, it was easy for us to delete this entire database and recreate it. But what about production mode? In production mode, I cannot go ahead and delete the database because there will be actual user data in this database table. I just want to create the two-factor code table. So to do that, what I would do is I will right click in the development mode on the table and go to the option, I will right click on my project name on the table and go to the option manage. Once you go to the option manage, you will see the list of tables over here. You will select the table that you want to create the script for. In this specific scenario, I want to create the script for two-factor codes because this is the table that I want to create in production. Here you will see these three dots. You will click edit data. You will have the option script as create and select top 1000. In my case, I'm going to select script as create because I need to create this table. So I will script as create the table. And now Azure Data Studio will give me the code that is needed to recreate this table in a different database. So I can go ahead, copy this code, go to my production version, run this following query on my database, and this query will create this table in your existing database. So you don't have to delete the entire database or drop the entire database and recreate it. In production, you can just run the following query. So I have shown you how you can do it in production. So don't go ahead and delete your production database. Do this only in development. Now we have created our database and the required table. Let's implement the further logic that we need. To implement the logic further, in our application's account controller API, we are going to go ahead and create three endpoints. These endpoints will be the HTTP post action methods that we will be calling from the account service of the Angular application. As the name suggests for these API endpoints, the send two-factor code endpoint will be used to send the two-factor code to the user via email or SMS. The session expiry notification will be used to expire the user's current session, and the validate two-factor endpoint will be used to validate the code that is entered by the user in the validate two-factor code form from the Angular application. These 3 points have been implemented in the account controller. To understand the logic better, we will go ahead and look at a diagram. As you can see in this diagram, when the user will make a request to log in into the account, the request is sent to the backend, and the backend API, which is the authentication API that we have implemented in the account controller, will send this request to the authentication service, where the authentication service validates the user's details. Then it will create a two-factor authentication token. Now, here in the authentication method, so far we had implemented the code where we check if the two-factor authentication is on or off. In this specific scenario, if the two-factor authentication is switched off, then we send the JWT token to the client. But if the two-factor authentication is switched on by the user, we cannot issue the JWT token unless we have validated the second step of authentication, which is to validate the two-factor code. Therefore, to validate or to start the second step of authentication, we will first issue a temporary two-factor token to the user instead of the actual JWT token. So we will save this temporary two-factor token, the two-factor code that we have generated for the user, and all other details related to the two-factor authentication, which is the step 2 of the authentication, in the database, so that later we can validate the values against the database stored values. Once we store the data in the database in the new table that we have created, we will return this temporary JWT or temporary two-factor token back to the client. Now this temporary two-factor token will be saved in the local storage of the client's browser, and we will also store the user ID. Both these values will be encrypted, so in order for us to validate these values in the backend, we have to first decrypt these values. Now we go to the step 2. In the step 2, once the user has received the temporary two-factor token, we will redirect the user to the send code component. In the send code component, we will start the session timer so that we can time the user's session, and when the session expires, we can clear the local storage. Here we will ask the user in the send code component whether they want to receive the two-factor code via email or SMS. We are not implementing SMS service, therefore the default provider type in this example will be email service. The user will select email and make a request to receive the two-factor code in their email or in their inbox. The request is sent to the backend, and this request is received by the API endpoint that we are going to implement, which is the send two-factor code. Here in the send two-factor code, we will make a request to the user service to send the two-factor code to the user. We have implemented an extension method in the user service called as send two-factor code async. So if we go to the implementation of this method, here we have specified all the logic that we need to send the two-factor code to the user via their selected provider, which in this case is email. As I mentioned earlier, in step 1, these two values are encrypted in the local storage. When the user makes the request to receive the two-factor code in their email, we have to attach these values to the headers of the request, of the HTTP request. So once we receive these values in the API endpoint, we are going to forward these values to the user service. In the user service, we are going to first decrypt these values using the data protection service. We have done this multiple times in the previous tutorials as well, where we have decrypted users' data using data protection provider. Once we have decrypted the details, that is the two-factor token and the user ID, then we can find the user from our database based on the user's ID. And then we can go ahead and validate the temporary two-factor token. And if the values that we receive are valid, then we will create a response and send it back to the user. In the response, the user will receive a response that the two-factor code is sent to the registered email of the user. And then the user will be redirected to the validate code page where they will have to enter the two-factor code that they have received in their email. Now in the step 3, the user will enter the two-factor code that they have received in their email, and they will make a request to the backend API, which is validate code. In account controller, here we have implemented the backend code method, that is the validate two-factor code method, which will validate the user's entered two-factor code which they are sending us in the request body. There's an extension method in user service called as validate two-factor code async. We have implemented this method which will do the logic of validating the user's two-factor code. In this method, we have also made sure that we reduce the number of attempts while we are trying to validate the user's code. So a user will have 3 attempts to validate their code. Once they have reached their attempts, which is they don't have any attempts remaining, we will lock the user's account. And once the user's account is locked, they will not be able to log in into the account unless they request the admin to unlock their account. So the process for validate two-factor code, assuming is successful, we then go to the next step, that is to issue a permanent JWT token, because previously we issued a temporary token to the user because only one step of authentication was passed. Now both the steps of authentication have successfully passed, so we will go ahead and return a JWT token back to the user. To return the JWT token, we have created a generate new token method in the authentication service. And here we are going to generate a new token for the user, set the values in the cookie of the browser storage, and return the access token. Now, once the access token is received by the user and when we set the values in the cookies, the user will be redirected to the return URL from the Angular application. So in that case, if the URL is protected, they will be able to access that URL because now they have the token in their browser storage. So pretty straightforward process. We have 3 steps in this two-factor authentication process. As I explained, you can go through this diagram. I will provide the link in the video description to download this diagram. You can go through it, and if you have any questions, you can use the comment section. Now the next step is going to the Angular application. In the Angular application, we are going to make the request from the send code component. So in the send code component, we have implemented the logic where we will start the session timer. As you can see in the diagram, we are going to start the session timer. So we have created a observer timer method over here that we are calling. We have initialized some form controls and the form group in the ngOnIt method and started the timer. We have shown the background image when the component loads. When the form is submitted, we call the onSubmit method because the user has decided how they want to receive their two-factor code, whether email or SMS, and they can make a request by submitting the form. When the form is submitted, the account service, we have implemented few methods over here. First one is the send expiry notification. When the session timer expires or the timer has reached its expiry time, we will go ahead and make a request to the endpoint in the account controller. This endpoint will go ahead and delete any tokens or two-factor codes from the users table, from the token table, and from the two-factor table. To do that, we have created an extension method in user service. And if you go to the implementation, you will find that this method is calling a delete user token async method, which is an extension method that I've created over here in this class. And all it does, it deletes tokens and codes from two tables, from the tokens and two-factor code table, and then returns the response back to the user. We are not doing anything with the response, therefore we are just console logging the response. We have deleted all the data related to that specific user based on the user ID from the following tables that I showed you over here. Now, when the user has decided that they want us to send the two-factor code via email, then we redirect the user to the validate code component, which we have created here. In the validate two-factor code component, you will see that when the user provides the code, they will submit the form, and when the form is submitted, we will go ahead and call the validate two-factor code method in the account service, and we will pass the code that was entered. Here in the validate two-factor code method, you will see I'm making a call to the endpoint, which is validate two-factor, which is already implemented in the account controller. As I showed you on the diagram, that if the user enters an invalid code, they will receive a notification that the code was invalid. Once they have reached the attempts of entering the code, their account will be locked and they will be shown a message on the component that, or on the view, that the account is locked. So this process is done through the account service, where we will call the validate two-factor code, and here we will map the response accordingly, where when the user's validation is successful, we will go ahead and clear the local storage, and we will set the username and user role for the user. So that should be it for this process of implementing two-factor authentication. So now when you want to implement a two-factor authentication, you would have to go ahead, first create the table, then implement the further logic for two-factor authentication in the auth method, create the 3 endpoints, and also create the associated extension methods that are being called in these endpoints. And then after you have created these extension methods, you can go ahead and go to the app settings file and change your email provider or update your email provider settings so that you can test and receive emails. We have already explained how to update the email provider in your app settings by in the email service video tutorial that we have created. So go ahead and watch that video tutorial. So go to the app settings and provide your username and password for your SendGrid or your Gmail account so that you can receive emails. And I have already done that, but I will not show you my email and password. So in this particular event, you would have to enter your email and your password. So now all the logic has been implemented. We will go ahead and build the application. Before I build the application, just to inform you that when you are adding the methods in user service, you would also have to enter them in your interface as well, so that you can access them in the account controller. So do that for the auth service as well. In the auth service, when you add the generate new token method, you will add it to the interface as well, so it can be accessed. So now we will go ahead and run our application and we will test it. And if everything works fine, then we have successfully implemented the two-factor authentication, and then you can go ahead and implement it in your project. So let's go ahead and run this application. So the application is loaded. Now I will go ahead and log in with the test credentials. In admin, in the development mode, if you have deleted and recreated the database like we did for the migrations, you will not have your old test user, so you would have the default user that we have created when the database is created for the first time. So we will use that default credentials and log in. Once we log in, as you see, we have been asked to provide the provider or select the provider on how we want to receive the two-factor code. In this case, I'm going to choose email because we have not implemented SMS. And the send code component is used in the Angular application to display this UI. So the send code component, as I explained, the code for the HTML and TS is already implemented, so you can go through it, and I've explained it earlier how the code works. So when the button is submitted, send button is clicked, the on submit method is fired off. Now I will go to my inbox, and here I'll make sure I don't have any email, so I can show you that I'm going to receive an email once I click send. So once I click send, the breakpoint is hit over here to the in the send two factor code method, and the send two factor code async method is called. So if we hit continue, in the send two factor code async method, we have received the request to send the code via email. As you can see here, the provider type is email. Here we will go through the logic of validating the details of the user, the two-factor temporary token. We will validate if it's valid. If it's valid, then we will go ahead and send the code to the user in the email service using the email service. So now if we go to the front end, we have been redirected to the validate authentication code page, or the validate code component that we have created in the Angular application. And here we have to enter a code that we have received in the email. So we have received an email with the code, so we can copy this code and then we can go and paste this code. Let me copy it again. So I'll enter a invalid code over here for the first time. So when I enter the invalid code, the validate two-factor code method is called, and here you can see that the validation takes place. When I continue and go back to the browser, I will receive a message that the code is invalid. That's obvious because the code that we have saved in the database doesn't match the code that we have entered over here, or the code that we have received. So we have received a code 91253, and if we go to the database and check the details that we have saved for this particular user, so let me log into Azure Data Studio. So once I will go to the database for the CMS project, go to tables and then open the two-factor code table. Here you can see that the code that I've received matches the code that I have stored in the database. Also, I have entered the code invalid code once, so my attempts remaining is 2. Initially we had set it to 3, so the attempts keep reducing every time you enter a invalid code, and the logic for that is implemented in this extension method that we have created in user service. So if we go to this implementation, here you will see that under this implementation we are reducing the number of attempts and we are committing these changes in the database. So now if you go back to the browser and enter the valid code and hit send, here we will receive a successful response from the browser or from the backend code, and we are redirected to the URL or to the home page in this case, and we are going to access our profile now without any issues. So our two-factor is on still. If we want to switch it off, we can go ahead and switch it off and save the changes. So in this way we have successfully implemented two-factor authentication in our project. You can follow the same logic to implement it in your Angular and ASP.NET Core project. And if you have any questions, you can use the comment section. I'll be happy to answer those questions. Do not forget to like and subscribe our channel, Tech Howdy. Also note that the code that we have used in this entire project, we will provide it in the video description. The link for the DevOps repo will be provided in the video description. Thank you very much. Have a good day.